They cite cataclysm for the extinction of dinosaurs over 60 million years ago.
Oh, yeah.
So why is it not also conceivable that 12,800 years ago there was a great cataclysm that changed life on Earth?
Because they would have
Maybe
found
they
it by now. It's kind of recursive. It didn't happen because we've been studying these time periods our entire careers, and my major professor's career going back another 40 years or so, that we couldn't have missed something so big. If you have blinders on, you can miss anything.
Now, more than ever, it's important to support companies and organizations that share our values. Our votes are not enough. Patriot Mobile not only shares our beliefs, but does something about it. They are America's only Christian conservative wireless carrier, and they donate a portion of every dollar to organizations that fight for causes you care about. Switch to Patriot Mobile now and get free activation with the promo code MATT. That's MATT. Switching is easy. Just go to patriotmobile.com/Matthew-Lohmeyer. That's patriotmobile.com/Matthew-Lohmeyer. Or call their U.S.-based customer service team at 972-PATRIOT. That's 972-728-7468. I'm happy that I switched to Patriot Mobile. And the more I talk to people, I continue to hear and learn that others are also considering switching to Patriot Mobile. I've got George Howard joining me today. George, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Happy to be on the show. Big fan of yours.
I'm a big fan of yours, and I learned about your work from my friend Randall Carlson, who's been on the show several times. He pointed me to one of at least a couple of websites that you either own or started or are directly affiliated with, which we'll get into, but it was Cosmic Tusk.
That's right. That's me.
Okay, you only. CosmicTusk.com, which is a phenomenal resource, and I'd like to get into that today somewhat, but while you think you're here to talk about one thing, and you are, you just clued me in on some work that you've been doing for the past at least maybe half decade or so that I'm going to start with because I want to make sure we get here, and I want to make sure we don't forget to talk about it, and I think it's a good hook at the beginning. Tal el-Hammam. What is Tal, not Tel, different location, Tal el-Hammam. What does that mean? What is it? And what work have you been doing with Tal el-Hammam?
Yeah, people might be more familiar with the term tell. And tells or talls are cultural hills, mounds, civilization, accumulation of material over thousands of years where people stayed at one location. So it might be a natural hill down at the bottom of it, but most of it is one way or another imported material. And they're called tells in Israel. And then if you cross the Jordan River, they're called talls. And this one is on the Jordanian side of the river. Everybody's heard of the West Bank. This is on the East Bank, right? And there has been an ongoing archaeological investigation of Tal el-Hammam for, I think, now 17, 18 years. So it is very well dug by a faithful biblical archaeological team, but with great scientific integrity. They balance their faith with their archaeological principles very, very well, and I have immense respect for that. I have only very lately become a better Christian, but I didn't go over there because of my faith or my Christmas and Easter Episcopalian approach to Christianity thus far. I've actually just joined a Bible study now, but totally unrelated to this. I went over there to help them take a good look at what they suspect, the forensic evidence for what they suspected that Tal had originally been represented and reported in the Bible as, which is the city of Sodom, which has been lost, if you will, or considered, complete Bible myth for our lives and many lives before us. But Dr. Stephen Collins and his team began digging there about 15, 16 years ago. And he had kind of reverse engineered the geography of the Bible, as you will. And as he'll tell you, and I've got a great video on my YouTube channel.
Where can people go to see it? What's the YouTube channel?
Yeah, that's George Howard and Cosmic Tusk should get you there. It's in Tusk TV. And my YouTube channel is not very sophisticated, but in fact, I need to upgrade it some. But it's at about 50,000 views. A great lecture that he gave on the top of the tall, explaining how he came to it. But he looked at the Genesis story and said this gives us a lot of geographical clues about where Sodom is. And strangely enough, and you'll see this in any kind of controversial or almost any discipline period, the people that are closest together in their beliefs diverge the most. And the first schism within the faithful about particularly the apologists who, believe the Bible is, largely true, if not entirely true, some of them, long suspected, it became kind of an article of faith, if you will, that Sodom was south of the Dead Sea for those believers. And that all emerged from a biblical archaeologist, kind of a starched collar type back in the 1920s. Can't recall his name right now. Who said that he believed the evidence showed it was south of the Dead Sea. Well, Collins didn't pay much attention to that. He looked at it under a new light, used the geographical clues, which are extensive, and said, for instance, that Genesis, I believe it's 22, refers to the Kikar, right, which is basically a circular area, and that that Sodom and the cities of the plain were in the Kikar, and the Kikar was well watered like Egypt, right, and like the Nile in Egypt was a well watered plain, and as in Egypt. And if you look at the Jordan River coming south into the Dead Sea, it spreads out, or it used to. Now it's been completely ravaged, but it used to spread out into a delta, which, as many deltas are, was kind of a miniature version upside down of what the Nile does when it goes into the Mediterranean. And second of all, south of the Dead Sea is some of the most forbidding territory on the face of the planet. That's the Negev and the Sinai, and it's just not a good place to live. Whereas north of the Dead Sea is some of the most fruitful agricultural area in the entire Fertile Crescent. And it makes sense to live there.
How far east of the Jordan are we talking?
6 miles. Yeah. And it is the nearest city to Jericho. And you might say, well, why has this never been investigated? Because it was later turned out, and I don't think anyone disputes this, the Sodom part is what's controversial, but that it turned out to be, during the Middle Bronze Age and early Middle Bronze Age, the largest city in the Levant. That it was a huge complex. So there's no question that Collins discovered that. And you might ask, well, why in the world did archaeologists miss that for so many years? And that's because it was a gun emplacement for the Jordanians during most of the 20th century, right? And it was heavily mined, which kind of surprises me because I'm like, when we're digging over there, I'm like, are you sure they have all these mines out of here? I mean, I want 100% success rate on mine clearing. But they've been walking and digging around there for 15 years. So I think it's
so you've been over there then, participating.
Yeah, I went over there on a dig
efforts.
in 2015 and 2016, and as a representative of the Comet Research Group, which we can discuss later, which is a team of largely forensic scientists who are involved in the Younger Dryas Impact and evidence for catastrophic impacts. And this was a little bit of a sidebar for them, actually something of a sidebar, but they seized on it when they got the request from the archaeological dig to investigate a layer a couple of meters down in the tall where it was completely burned and destroyed. So you can imagine, I guess you could call it their surprise or their success when he was saying, I believe that the geographical evidence indicates that this is the appropriate place for Sodom. And then indeed there was a large mound there, much larger than the other ones around it. And there are a number of different cultural sites like that in that part of the Jordan, but this was the biggest. And as I said, it had been covered with guns and barbed wire.
So how deep are we talking? I know, so my wife and I have been to Israel. And she did a study abroad there. And in fact, we were going to lead a tour there. We had 10 families signed up to come with us and go on a tour back into Israel for 10 or 11 days. But then COVID hit, the famous phrase, COVID hit. So we had to cancel that trip, and everyone was saddened that they could no longer go over for this trip. But, we see these tells in Israel. And some of them have layer upon layer upon layer, thousands of years of building and rebuilding and squishing, and new civilization pops up on top of old civilization. Talk to us about what they think is Sodom. How much of that was it all completely under earth, and how deep? You said there were these. It was in use by armed forces. Now, was that all over the top of?
Yeah,
You
that
called
was
it
all
it's a
on the
tall.
top.
So,
Yeah, and
how
it made
many
a good
layers deep are
lookout.
we talking? Just the next layer down?
No, it's like I say, between a meter and 2 meters down that you hit the destruction layer, and that's roughly 1,700 BC in the early Middle Bronze Age. But it even goes down to 8,000 years ago. It goes all the way back to the Chalcolithic, which are generally the earliest recognized cultural, somewhat sophisticated tool-making people in that area. So they had a burn layer, and they had a variety of kind of untested evidence that they wanted somebody to take a look at. And I got contacted by an old catastrophist, because that's what we are, people like me. We're catastrophists. And that's actually a very, very old term. And people that, as opposed to being a uniformitarian, that believes that everything, any kind of phenomena we see in geology, were all created over long periods of time by processes that we can identify today, which is absolutely the truth. But the uniformitarianism, kind of because of the Enlightenment and the pushing away of faith for scientific rationality, they went too far. They tossed out the catastrophic stories of our deep ancestors in 350 cultures around the world that speak of tremendous catastrophes in the past. And then I believe there were multiple catastrophes. So those are uniformitarian geology. People like me, you call them catastrophists. One old catastrophist in London contacted me. Picture an old Tweety fella, that had been sticking to his guns for 50, 60 years. And he got in touch and he said, "George, I know you're a member of the Comet Research Group. You all have the skills to assess this archaeological dig and see whether there's any evidence or that their suspicions might be correct, given the testing that you all can do." So I went over there alone and, dug about 2/3 of the time with the rest of the gang, and about another third of the time collected samples, some of which ended up being fairly significant. And then went back the next year with some of the big guys. A great archaeologist here in North Carolina, Clay Swindell, who actually discovered what we believe is they call it Site X, where the lost colony of Roanoke decamped to. And that's been in National Geographic, et cetera. So went over there with Clay and a medical doctor, Dr. Whitwer, and Malcolm LeCompte, who's a mainstay, Dr. Malcolm LeCompte, a former rocket scientist and a mainstay of the Comet Research Group, and very, very skilled forensic scientist as well. And we went over there and did more sample collection. And we brought all that stuff back, shipped it to the lab, some of them around the world, and spent 6 years writing a paper that was published last September in Scientific Reports, which is a Nature publication. And it is now the number one downloaded, and it looks to be a while before it gets dethroned, number one downloaded publication at Scientific Reports. And it's actually risen to the number 600 out of 22 million tracked scientific articles of all time. And it's in the top 20 of Scientific Reports of all time. And a lot of those other ones are kind of patented kind of stuff where if you're taught in a class this process or that process, you'll go read that original paper. So some of those aren't terribly interesting, but they're important. This is, I think, arguably the most popular scientific publication on Earth right now. And it made worldwide news, minor news, not front page news, but there were hundreds of articles published on that paper. And we concluded, using much of the same evidence that we used to in favor of the Younger Dryas impact, to conclude that indeed there had been a cosmic airburst at that location 1,700 years ago, and that it destroyed that city and actually destroyed agriculture.
That's what caused burning.
That's right. That's right. And there's pottery, which is melted on one side only. All the walls are torn down. There's very distinct geochemical signals, particularly with platinum, which is also an indicator for the Younger Dryas event. So we believe that many of these impacts fall all within the category of the torrid meteor stream, and that we might have encountered those objects a number of times, including in 1908 on June 30th in Tunguska. And I can't remember the precise name of the paper. These things are usually pretty long, but a Tunguska-sized airburst in the Jordan Valley in 1700 BC.
So when was the paper published? This one that you said is extremely, this research that you guys write it for 6
of
years?
Last year, 2021.
September of last
if
year.
you search el-Hammam, it is a deep, deep rabbit hole. Not as deep as the Younger Dryas event, but a deep one.
Yeah.
So, it took 6 years to write that paper. Hell of a lot of work went into it, and it was, widely noted. And of course, like I said, there's schisms within even the faithful. A lot of the Christians hung on to their idea. Well, I grew up knowing it was south of the Dead Sea, right? So you kind of got to battle your way out of that crowd first. And of course, the people who reject any kind of, credence to the Bible and biblical texts and stories, if you will, they of course went absolutely ape, and they tried to have the paper retracted and taken down by scientific reports and protested it over
because it talked about the Bible. Because it talked about the Bible. That's the rationale.
And it distanced itself from the biblical story. It can't avoid mentioning it because that's what the dig is over there doing. I mean, all we were looking at was, did something of a dramatic nature with high temperatures, high pressures, leave evidence of that kind of event? And indeed it did. So it was quite a success, just showing that, an airburst happened there 1,700 years ago. Is it Sodom? You're not going to find a welcome to Sodom sign there, right? But it fits a lot of other big biblical geography, and they even know where Gomorrah is, right down the street. And we went over there, and that's another very, very old tall. So that was
Where's Gomorrah?
It's in the same on the east bank, and on the west bank of the Jordan. And one of the interesting things about Tal el-Hammam, it's the mirror city to Jericho, which is the oldest city on earth. And Tal el-Hammam arguably is too. And both of those sit at the hill of their senior city where the king would be, right? And that's Jerusalem is as to Jericho as Tal el-Hammam is to Amman up the hill. And the king always had their winter palace, or is it their summer palace? I guess they came down there in the winter because it was cooler, right? But the King Abdallah, their King Hussein's son, his palace is still there. They've had a palace from a king there for thousands and thousands of years. But I tell you, Matt, the thing that's most interesting to me about it is it has the best second act, if you accept or give some validity to our claims, and obviously there was a city there 3,700 years ago, but it has the best second act of any archaeological site I've ever seen, and it's well acknowledged, even by not particularly faithful archaeologists, but those who say that the Exodus has a certain route. Whether you believe it or not, there is a certain progression, and they came from Egypt, and it likely took this happened here and this happened there and whatnot. Putting aside the difficulty of finding Mount Sinai, which I think is still a mystery. It's at the foot of Mount Nebo. It is the promised land. Tal el-Hammam sits right at the foot of where Moses is believed to have looked into the promised land. And at that time, it would have been the largest encampment there. And it has always been accepted by Exodus believers and associated people that Tal was the last campsite of the Israelites before they sent the spies over into Jericho and then went over there and conquered Jericho itself. So that's a hell of a second act to be Sodom, and it's culturally sterile for 700 years. that one of the indicators that something dramatic happened is it became highly salient. The entire valley did, and it's also very evident at the Tall too. And what we believed happened is that Airburst whipped the Dead Sea up into the Jordan Valley and coated it with salt, which destroyed agriculture. And it also would have become quite a revered, if not, feared location after that. They
So
didn't
you said
resettle.
there's
Yeah.
burn marks, or I think that's
Mm-hmm.
maybe what you said on
And there's
a
ash.
particular
You can still
side.
smell the ash.
Which
Yes.
side are the burn marks on? The west side of
Um,
the artifacts. I'm trying to picture.
yeah,
You
yeah,
said,
yeah. It'd be one side there. There are some artifacts that are just boiled and melted on one side, right?
and it's on the
Like,
west side of the
well, the
city.
artifact doesn't have an east or a west, but it would have come from the
Oh,
south.
it's just an artifact. I see.
That's right. And it would have come from the south. And the indications are from the way the buildings felt and whatnot that I think generally from the southwest. So something very high energy came up from the southwest and destroyed that city. And we found, 125 some pages of evidence for it. It's a very, very detailed paper. Scientific papers take a lot of forms, and they can be small and legitimate and true. But, there's really something to, how many tests were done, how many people were involved, how many disciplines, because this is a highly multidisciplinary field, any catastrophism. It takes a lot of different kinds of scientists and experts. And they threw everything they had into this paper. And it is extraordinarily detailed. And I think that just infuriated the critics even more because it's kind of hard to refute.
Right. Well, I'll put a link in our YouTube description to that paper. We'll make sure we get that in there.
Yeah. There have been 500,000, well, it's 400,000 downloads of the paper since September.
That's
from
great.
Nature. And that's people presumably reading the paper, at least skimming it. And that's a hell of a lot for a scientific
Right.
publication.
Yeah, good. Well, I'd not heard of it, so I was happy to bring this up at the very beginning.
Hey, that's why I'm on, man. Yeah.
Yeah, these guys invite you in to participate in their dig because of your expertise with comet, asteroid research, and so forth. How is it that you get involved in this line of work? How did you take interest? You're a Senate staffer, I think, and I heard you tell a story when I met you in Sedona about the work in D.C. that you were doing, perhaps that made you take interest in all of this. So talk about that for a minute, if you would.
Yeah, that was a long time ago, but it was a pretty dramatic period in my life and something I still really treasure. But coming out of the University of North Carolina, and I should warn your readers, I'm the pajama scientist of this group. As I call it, the first paper we published, it was 23 PhDs in me, right? That I'm the tag along. I'm kind of like to these, and many of them are eminent scientists. I mean, these people are very highly credentialed people, but they let me come along, kind of like the basketball team has the ball boy, and ball boy knows all the stats and he knows all the inside story and he rides around with the team on the bus and he's all but a member of the team, right? And that's kind of my role with these scientists. And but it gives me flexibility to come on shows like yours, to stretch the boundaries of speculation on my blog and not threaten my main credibility. And a lot of those guys are very busy in their own lab work too. So I'm kind of a little bit of I wouldn't say the public face because I'm not appointed as it, but I'm probably the person who runs my mouth most about it on the group. So I did come across it while I was working in the U.S. Senate. I've been in the private sector for 25 years now, have an environmental company. But prior to that, when I came out of UNC, I went to work in the U.S. Senate as a mailroom for the staffer for the first senator and kind of worked my way up and ended up writing some floor statements and involving myself in some policy work. But then for the second senator, he was a freshman fellow named Locke Faircloth, who's little remembered, but a hell of an influence in my life and just a tremendous, tremendous individual and character. And he was a farmer of some note and a businessman in several different businesses. He was a multi-business business. He was into a lot of different businesses, but he's primarily a farmer. And on large scale. He had 40,000 acres in a county here in North Carolina. And I had for him, I was his environmental staffer, and we ultimately had even a subcommittee. And that subcommittee was focused on wetlands was one of its things. It was the clean air, private property, nuclear safety, and wetlands clean air, wetlands, private property, and nuclear safety subcommittee. That later was actually chaired by Hillary Clinton, and they moved the name around, but we created that name. It had obviously all those things, had clean air, it had nuclear regulation and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and whatnot. But what my boss was focused on was wetlands, because he was a farmer, and the wetland regulations that I ultimately built a business out of were just really kicking in at that time. And there were big, in the early 90s, big private property disputes where people were like, hey, I've had this land in my family. This was my retirement property. And now I have to get a permit and I can barely use it, et cetera. And a lot of that's died down now. It's all been kind of baked into people's understanding of their property, and they've accepted the regulations more or less. But at the time, there was a significant, part of the conservative Republicans wanted to deregulate wetlands. And Senator Faircloth wanted to lead that effort. And he actually asked me, he said, right after he got back from Bob Dole, put him on the committee, he said, is wetlands in that committee? I said, yes, sir. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act is regulated of Environment and Public Works. And he said, well, get rid of them. Right? And I said, oh, shit, it's probably ain't going to work out, but I'll do my best. And he wanted to deregulate them. So we had a highly deregulatory bill. And as part of shepherding that bill for him, I was asked, I became familiar with wetland regulation, right? And even wetland types. And there are a number of wetland types. And actually, sometimes I'll flub this on a podcast, but there are things like marshes, bogs, vernal pools, prairie potholes, precosins, floodplain forests, all of that kind of stuff. And I was getting broadly familiar with all those. And most of them were fairly self-explanatory about what kind of landscape you were talking about that was being regulated. And then there was one that kept popping up called Carolina Bays. And that was interesting to me because it was listed along with all these national types. Prairie potholes are a number of states, but most of these things you can find at various places across the U.S. And here's one named after, our state or our neighboring state, South Carolina. And I said, that's curious. Carolina Bay, and what an odd name. And I didn't understand it very well, but at that time, it was just prior to the internet. It wasn't easy to look that kind of stuff up, and it just kind of stuck in the back of my mind. What in the hell is this thing? I figured it must have something to do with harbors, or some kind of coastal or marine type wetland. So I was in the back of my mind just wondering, what the hell is that? And then one day the boss popped up, was kind of his way. He's almost a little Trump-like, and he said, get a map of my farm. And I said, you mean like from government sources? He said, yeah. Get one from the Geological Service. I said, okay, yeah. I'll call up the USGS congressional liaison and see if I can get a map. He said, yeah, I want a 1 to 22,000 topo quad. He knew what he wanted. I've since become very familiar with what those are. I had no idea. And I'm like, okay, a 1 to 22,000 topo quad. And he gave me the name of them. They all have little names, and there might be 10 or 20 of those in a given county. And he knew which one he wanted. And I called up the USGS congressional liaison and said, hey, my boss wants a topo quad of this part of Sampson County, and gave him the name. And, of course, they were very solicitous. That's what those people do. They're trying to keep them happy. That's an easy ask. And damn if they didn't pop up, that afternoon with a map tube. Said, here's your map for Senator Faircloth. And I said, all right, man, I got the goods for the boss. And took it into his office, and, he laid it out on his desk. And I don't even know what he really wanted to look at, but he wanted, something about his own land, and didn't have any of the maps available up there. And he's looking over, and I'm kind of looking over his shoulder. And I saw dozens and dozens of perfectly elliptical, perfectly aligned figures drawn in dashed green lines. The USGS even had its own signature for what a Carolina Bay is. And I looked over his shoulder. I kind of gave away my punchline there, but I looked over his shoulder and I said, "Hey, boss, what are all those green circles all over your farm, scattered here, and then there'll be another patch of them here, and there's a giant one, and they're all different sizes."
They're all on his land.
All on his land. They're all over eastern North Carolina. There are hundreds of them within 20 miles of me right now. I'm down at the coast. I said, "What are all those circles all over your farm?" And he said, "Meteor holes." And I was like, meteor holes? First of all, he wasn't very sciencey really anyway, and I was like, what in the world does he know about? I said, meteor holes? I said, thinking to myself, I was kind of a science geek, and particularly as a kid, and I, read a whole lot and loved my state, and anything that was interesting about it from a science perspective, I thought I knew. I said, meteor holes. And I said, but Senator, with all due respect, I don't think North Carolina's ever noted as having any impact features or craters anywhere. And he goes, and I think they call them craters, boss. And he goes, "Oh, no. He goes, "Now they call them Carolina Bays now." And I said, no shit. That's what that wetland type is, that the EPA and all the regulatory agencies break out as its own type. You say it's a meteor hole. He goes, "Oh, yeah, it was a big deal when I was a boy. Big deal." And it was. There was a little national sensation. It was on the cover of Harper's Magazine. I later found out and clearly had seen that magazine. And it had on the cover the comet that hit the Carolinas.
But it wasn't called the Carolina Bays that was just a recent naming convention.
No, they had called them Carolina Bays long before that. And it's because they had bay trees in them, right? It's a little bit of a confusing misnomer. Yeah, the same kind of bay leaves that you put in spaghetti sauce, right? Those grow in profusions, herbaceous plants, or just wild in Carolina Bays. They're chock-a-block full of them. They have a lot of unique ecology, and that's why they're very special in the wetland world, and they've had tremendous damage done to them to farming. And you can see farms that are defined, the actual ditching and whatnot will be just within a Carolina Bay. And as I say, they're elliptical. They're not circular, and they're not oval. They often get called oval, but they're elliptical, and that's pretty important, particularly to a researcher, Antonio Zamora, who works really hard on it these days, trying to figure out the puzzle. So when I saw that, I was like, well, that's the damnedest thing I've ever heard, that there not only might there be some kind of crater in North Carolina, but there'd be hundreds and hundreds of them. And indeed, there are thousands. We've now counted 55,000 of them on the East Coast. And those ellipses range from New Jersey, and Long Island has a number of them, all the way down to Georgia. And they go in arc. And that they're all pointed, their long axis is aligned in the same direction. So as you're further north, they're pointing almost due west. And if you go down to Georgia, they're pointing north. And where they're most highly concentrated, which is kind of the North Carolina-South Carolina line, even though the whole coastal plain is littered with them, they're pointed northwest, and they all align. So when they first came across Carolina Bays, it was they're somewhat already noted. I'm not sure if they'd have put the name to them before that or not, but in the 1930s, as part of the Works Progress Administration and the New Deal, they did a lot of the first aerial mapping surveys. And one of those early ones was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And they came back and rolled out the new photographs. And, aerial photography is a very exotic technology. Somebody in your field would understand that. We continue to come out with exotic ways to look back at ourselves. But at that time, that was high-tech stuff and just fascinating to them. So they rolled out the photos, and they said, holy shit, these are craters. Something slammed into the coast. It just looked clear as hell. And then they went and looked at other photographs and whatnot. It became kind of a sensation. And scientists from all over the country scrambled to the Carolinas and started digging in them because it just so clearly looked like something had slammed into the earth. They started digging in them looking for rocks, not rocks, looking for meteorites.
So have they found forensic evidence? Is there forensic evidence all along the East Coast then that these were impactor sites?
We later identified some very intriguing evidence as part of the Younger Dryas Impact. It was a big part of the first paper. It has since been relegated out of the evidence because it is so controversial and it's not anywhere near the best evidence. They never found meteorites in them. That was quickly determined. But, the same thing happened to Guska. That Leonard Kulik, who first went over there, I think it was 1921 or something, 13, 14 years later. Maybe it's 27. But when he first went out to the, Siberian tundra, taiga there, and went and tracked down the purported explosion that had occurred in 1908 that knocked down 20 million trees over, hundreds and hundreds of square miles, all of them pointing out radially from the same direction. One of his first tasks was to dig in the neat oval bogs at the epicenter of that thing. They were neat oval bogs that were kind of different than the surrounding water features. So he dug and dug and dug in those looking for meteorites. And then the exact same thing happened just a decade or so later in the Carolinas, where they were digging into them, saying, surely there's something here. And that was kind of a red herring because nothing was ever found. Now, there's microscopic evidence and there's some geochemical evidence, right? But you're not going to find a meteorite because likely it was some type of shock wave.
And you don't need an actual rock to impact the earth in order to create those
that's what some of us
elliptical
believe. And it remains
holes
very controversial, Matt.
Yeah.
And as I say, I generally leave it out of some discussions because it is kind of poking science. Even, and this is important, back to my original thing about how there be schisms within people that largely agree that are already way out on a limb. Some very important members of the Comet Research Group itself absolutely object to any kind of impact or shock wave or airburst formation of the Carolina Bays themselves.
So what is the alternative cause that they would propose formed those?
It's uniformitarian. It is not catastrophic, and it's wind and wave.
Wind and waves.
Yeah, there's a certain kind of glacial wind. I think this is all a real stretch. Even though I'm still open-minded, I'm not absolutely convinced that they were caused by something from above. I'll tell you what I am convinced of in a moment. But that they believe that during various periods of the ice ages, 3 different periods, they believe they were formed during. And this is not entirely settled even on their side, but one of the most common, actually there are 22 theories as to their formation, right? Everything from, and some of these are old and been discarded, but everything from fish nests, that there were whales wallowing in them and crazy stuff like that, to karstic, limestone sinks, but there's no limestone there, so you got to put that away. Some people even believe they're hydrogen vents from deep earth hydrogen. There's all sorts of speculation.
Those all seem so much less tenable than the idea that things came in from outer space,
not if you're a uniformitarian
into the earth.
That's right.
But
that's where geology, and earth science puts such a uniformitarian hard spin on everything that you can't get a catastrophic look at it.
Why can't the uniformitarian? Because I mean, our day in, day out, year after year observation is that a lot happens a grain of sand at a time and a trickle of water at a time. But how is it that these strict uniformitarians cannot concede that sometimes there are cataclysmic events? I mean, they cite cataclysm for the extinction of dinosaurs over 60 million years ago.
Oh yeah.
So why is it not also conceivable that 12,800 years ago there was a great cataclysm that changed life on Earth?
Because they would have found it by now. It's kind of recursive. It didn't happen because we've been studying these time periods our entire careers, and my major professor's career going back another 40 years or so, that we couldn't have missed something so big.
I mean, to your
You
point,
can
though,
miss
you get up in.
anything. If you have blinders on, you can miss anything.
That's right. Well, you get up in an aircraft, for example, which hasn't been around for centuries, and you're taking optical images of the East Coast. And I've seen these pictures. I mean, the pictures are remarkable of these impactor sites, or I don't know if I should appropriately call them impactor sites, but there are these elliptical indentations all across the Carolinas and all the way up to the Northeast. And as you're saying, they all appear to fall along a similar azimuth. Yeah, I mean, it's really a stunning image. Now, you couldn't have seen that, I'm guessing, standing on a hilltop in North Carolina. You could get a sense for a few of them at a time as a man on the ground, but you couldn't get the sense that we now can either from the sky or from space. I mean, we've
You're
got so much.
exactly right, Matt. They are so subtle that people spend their entire lives around Carolina bays and just know them as the local wet hole. And
Yeah, I mean,
they all have a very distinct and very bright colored sand rim, brilliant white sand in
what causes
varying
that?
degrees around that. It was what
Burrowing
was
whales.
out of it. Yeah, burrowing whales, exactly. And back to what the kind of the accepted mainstream landing point for what they believed it was wind and waves. That somehow katabatic winds from the glaciers came down during 3 periods. Some of them separated, maybe it's 4 periods, separated by as much as 10,000 years. Came, formed bays. They stopped forming. The wind came back, formed them again. They have no explanation, and they'll even tell you this, for how the original depressions formed. But remember, this is the coastal North Atlantic coastal plain, so it's very shallow. The groundwater table is very shallow, but somehow there was a depression, and the water-filled depression cast waves up against the sand on the sides, and it enlarged and elongated itself and just blew itself into a perfect hole in the ground. And you can find places around the world where you do have wind-formed lakes, but they're nowhere near as perfect as these.
How big are these bays?
Oh, from 400 feet to 10 or 11 miles and everything in between. Yeah. And people will live on them. Highways in North Carolina and country roads will actually follow the rim because they didn't want to build and have to go through the wetlands, and that was more difficult, corridor to build the road in, or maybe historically that wasn't the footpath. So you'll find that roads arc around the edge of them, and that the churches will be up there because the cemeteries are better placed in the sand rim, right? So human organization on the coastal plain was somewhat influenced, but it's exactly like you're saying. They didn't know that they were absolute perfect ellipses. And you know what an ellipse is, and this is all credit to a fellow named Antonio Zamora, who has a very popular YouTube channel on the bays, for the bays. It's not popular from a global subject sense, but in this little slice of the world, Antonio is a big voice. And he published a paper in Geology, the Journal of Geology, I guess it's getting on 10 years ago. And he added a lot to the discussion. And I would say it's kind of the predominant catastrophist interpretation of them. And that is that there was an impact somewhere around Saginaw, Michigan, because if you follow their azimuth lines all the way back and then account for the Coriolis effect, isn't that the way you say it? Where if you cast something into the air, the earth is also turning. So you got to do some math there. But if you follow all that back, it goes to Saginaw Bay, which is kind of an interesting anomalous feature, that makes up the thumb of Michigan, right? So that's Saginaw Bay. And the idea would have been, and it's not a crater, but if something slammed into the ice sheet, then that would have been a mile or two thick. If you throw something into ice, you're going to shatter the ice before you make a hole, or a typical hole. You're not going to make the same hole you would have made if there is no ice. So it might be that Saginaw Bay is kind of a relic feature of that impact on the ice, but it would have cast tremendous chunks of ice into the lower atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, and they would have fallen across that arc. And excuse me, I should have mentioned, and I was part of at least the aerial discovery of this using LIDAR. But if you go into Kansas and Nebraska, there's a whole nother bay field that points back to Saginaw Bay as well. So it goes from New Jersey and Long Island all the way down to Georgia, kind of parts, and then picks back up. And they look identical to the ones in the Carolinas. So the same process was underway there. My conclusion, personally, tentative conclusion is I can't be sure of the formation mechanism, but they all happened at the same time. Whatever happened at the same time in an instant.
That's clear to you?
Yeah, that's clear to me, because if you had 3 or 4 different formation periods, you'd be able to say, well, this is class 1 of them. These look like this. They're oriented slightly differently because the wind was a little bit different direction. They've got to be able to maintain, which they don't. They'll usually reject any line of questioning that you give them along these lines. But the wind came and went, and each time it came back and oriented the bays identically. You would see genetic classes of them. You'd have class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4. And these are this age, and they would have different looks because of their age. But the bays do vary as you move. And it's funny, in the Carolinas, they tend to be absolutely perfect ellipses and have a more elongated form. And then as you move north and move south, they get more distorted. Right? So the perfect ones are here and the distortions are there. And that reminds you of a blood spatter pattern, where you can get a certain axis where it's formed perfectly and then more deformation out to the side if you take a thing of paint and flip it like that, or kick some water into the sand at the beach. But what Antonio said is that if something slammed into Michigan at that time in the ice sheet, it would have caused a tremendous earthquake. And that earthquake, called a magnitude 10, 11, 12, he defines that stuff, but just absolutely horrific earthquake. And that would have shook the coastal plain and caused the liquefaction of the sand, right? And if you go and look up sand liquefaction due to earthquakes, you can see pictures in Japan and elsewhere in the Philippines where you'll see cars that are totally sunk into the sand. You see just the top of the roof, or you'll see an apartment building which is sunk down into the sand because it shook it. There's a shallow water table. The sand essentially liquefies for a short period, and things are able to sink into it. So Antonio speculated that first the earthquake hit, then those, silly as it sounds, hypersonic ice boulders, there's no other way to put it.
The first hypersonic glide weapons.
Yeah, there you go. Came hauling ass in, slammed into that liquefied sand, and he's done a number of, scaled down experiments that show that it creates the same type lip, that the rims do, and that's all cast out of there, and it may have affected the sand to make it a lighter color because it would have been high pressure, presumably high heat, and that there was a terrible, terrible day whenever it formed. Then there are other advocates of the theory that Michael Davies, who's a good friend, who's absolutely convinced it happened 800,000 years ago, which I think just can't be, but he's stuck there because of it.
Why does he pick that date?
Where they form on terraces at various locations and the dates of those terraces. So he can make a case, but then others will make a strong counter case too. But that's why I say at the bottom line, I believe they all happened at the same time. And whether that was the Younger Dryas or another period, because I believe there have been multiple encounters with these objects scattered throughout history and prehistory. It's clear to me that the other analogs of them around the world, the original study that kind of put it to bed in 1974, a guy named Ray Kakarowski, it was funded by NASA. And he went and he said kind of two things. He said that you can find in Chile in the North Slope, And in West Texas, wind-formed lakes that align themselves. Well, that's true. You can go look at those on the North Slope. I've been to the North Slope twice. I've seen those analog lakes. Gotcha. They're not Carolina bays, man. They're just not. They're higgledy-piggledy, all over the landscape like bays. They can be varying sizes, but they don't have that perfect symmetrical form repeating again and again and again. That winds just don't do that, in my estimation.
So how many of these bays did you say there are that we're aware of?
Yeah, that's, kind of a irritant to me because you'll see them discussed. They'll always be, there are 500,000 of them. They're absolutely
500,000.
No. You'll see that quoted when
Oh.
you go look at Carolina bays, and just being a geek on it, it's actually about 55,000.
Which is still, I mean,
yeah,
that's
we
more
have
than
documented every single one of them too.
That's a lot of bays.
Oh, good God, man! Some of these fellows have spent countless hours over years and gone and pulled tape on every single one of them on GIS.
Well, if you think of the size of those, even hundreds of them would be a lot of them. But tens of thousands of them is just extraordinary.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think, well, why aren't children taught that, let's say, I think one of the formation periods that they believe is 22,000 years ago. Well, my God, we'd have been the land of lakes. That it would have been lake after lake after lake after lake after perfect lake. And that's interesting, but they don't do that. Carolina bays are the crazy ant in the attic of coastal geology. They do not want to talk about her. She's stuck up there. They don't want to roll her downstairs. They put her to bed. We got this under control. Subject over. Don't bug me about this, is the response you get from them.
So talk to me about the timing then. Apparently there are various views. You're of the opinion that they've all occurred at the same time whenever they happened. But I presume, perhaps incorrectly, that you are of the view that they maybe were formed during the Younger Dryas period.
Yeah, but again, I've got, even though that's where I started, how I began in this, and I did my original website, long gone now, georgehoward.com, back when that kind of stuff, pre-Facebook, had an eponymous website, and I put a lot of Carolina-based stuff up there, and that was kind of my thing. And this is what led me to the Comet Research Group, or what ultimately became the Comet Research Group. I'll tell that story in a second. But for the very serious investigation that has to pick its best evidence to prove the Younger Dryas event, the Carolina bays were removed from the main presentation of evidence because it was too controversial and it wasn't the best evidence, right? Your best evidence shouldn't be controversial. It should be incontrovertible, right? And the increase in platinum at the Younger Dryas layer, and might confuse your guests who haven't been introduced to it, we can do that. But the various signatures and evidence we find at the Younger Dryas, a lot of that is incontrovertible. How it was caused is, but the bays, it's not as clear. So I call the bays the kooky caboose of the theory. It'll always follow around behind us. Anybody that looks in the Younger Dryas is going to stumble onto the Younger Dryas Impact, is going to stumble onto the bay connection. But we leave it out of the papers now, right? When you're going into court, you might have a lot of good circumstantial evidence that is damn worth talking about on a crime podcast or whatever it is, but it's not what you take into court. And what we take into court is the geochemical evidence and spherules and whatnot. But I'll tell you how it led into this. So in the 90s, I had that website. I put up information on the bays. And then I started getting pinged by kind of a nutty guy named William Topping in about 96, 97. And he was something of a paranoid schizophrenic archaeologist. But I think he was damn right about some things, and he kicked off what became our investigation. And he was, saying, I'm finding impact markers in Clovis points, which are the original North American spear point that define the Clovis people. And I believe there was a high radiation event, et cetera. But the stuff was kind of kooky. I didn't maybe correspond a little bit. But then one day I got an email from Dr. Richard Firestone. And I looked at his address, and it was 1 Cyclotron Drive, Berkeley, California. I said, well, this guy's for real, man. He's up there, got a cyclotron, you know? And he said, I've been contacted by William Topping. He's a character, but I think he's on to something. And I'm joining with him to write a paper. And as you know, he was Googling around. We believe 13,000 years ago, thereabouts, that there was a tremendous catastrophe in North America. And he found your paper, and I had written a 27-page paper on the Carolina Bays. Whole other story there. I had a buddy in geology class who'd gone back to Carolina to pick up the last couple of classes, and he said, hey, you're all into this. This is one of the subjects you can write about in my geology classes, Carolina Bays. Could you write me some notes on this? So I banged out a 27-page paper, put it up on my website. Topping and then Firestone had found that. And that was independent. It speculates in that paper that the Bay cataclysm might be related to the Younger Dryas climate crash 13,000 years ago. They independently found that. And that's always interesting. When they believed there was a cataclysm 13,000 years ago, I'd never heard of Carolina Bays. I had never, didn't know of their work. And they believed something happened 13,000 years ago of a tremendously energetic nature. So that right there was very intriguing. And so I corresponded with them. In 2001, they published a paper in the Mammoth Trumpet, which is a well-respected but smallish journal on paleo Indian archaeology. And they made some mistakes in that paper, and they kind of stuck to a radiation and energetic particle theory that we later cast aside. And so it got panned by critics to the extent that it got much attention. But I was kind of in on things a little bit. And then it died away. And then in 2005, I get another email from Dr. Alan West, who remains a mentor and tremendous friend of mine. And he spoke out at the Sedona conference we both went to and that I spoke at. And Alan said, hey, these guys published that paper in 2001. I'm interested in reviving their theory. I believe that it was actually impacts, mostly airbursts from the Taurid meteor stream. And I've got a approach that I think supports it. And he had a very interesting hack. His hack was, we're going to go, and I think he already had this underway, go to Paleo-Indian sites that were very well regarded. The dating was proven. They were accepted in the literature, and that you knew that on this stratigraphic wall where you can see the changes in soil over time, that right here on that wall is where 13,000 years ago occurs. And the unique features of that kind of situation, and there are several dozen of them in the U.S., is that right at that point, it's actually 12,800, probably 887, probably June, but let's just use 13,000 because it takes too long to say that. 13,000 years ago is where you first find the Clovis points. And they're always below that layer and never above it. And that's where you always find the megafauna.
And this is referred to as the black mat layer that I've heard about.
And not only do they know where that line is, but most of those sites actually show a distinct change in the color of the soil called the black mat. And if anyone searches Younger Dryas black mat, you can see hundreds of pictures of it from around the world and even over in Belgium. It's very distinct in the European cover sands. At that same time, there's a thin black line. Now, if people are familiar with the comet dinosaur impact, they know that was also defined by what at the time was called the KT boundary. That's rock, right? So that was 66 million years ago. And that has had time to form into hard rock.
Maybe if we gave it another tens of millions of years, our black mat layer would be a black rock layer,
That's right.
a thin black rock, right?
And all of the approaches to proving the comet dinosaur all applied to what they used forensically to examine the black mat, or actually technically just below the black mat. The black mat itself was probably the ecological and climate changes where it turned into a wasteland, a very wet, cold, algal wasteland during the 1200-year Younger Dryas climate crash, where temperatures crashed 20, 25 degrees Fahrenheit in the northern hemisphere over a long weekend and stayed that way for 1,200 years. That is what formed the black mat, probably the first few hundred years after it. But if you go just below the black mat, that's what Dr. West and what quickly became a handful of others and then a large team, they said, let's investigate this soil. And no archaeologist had ever done it with transmission electron microscopes and chemical diagnostics, to tell you exactly what's in there and what is the geochemical makeup of this. And it turns out that that's dramatically different at that point. That ultimately, the first you find a number of indicators, particularly carbon, silicate, and particularly important, magnetic spherules. And those same spherules are found at the KT boundary too, where the dinosaurs walked out. And they can be, and often are, microscopic, where you at least need a optical microscope to see it, fairly powerful. And then you need a transmission electron microscope, an atomic microscope, which aren't very handy, and no archaeologists had ever used that, to definitely characterize them as to their formation, which is as follows: that if there was a swarm, which we believe there was over 3 to 5 hours of impactors of varying sizes, mostly relatively small, say 50 meters to 150 meters, etc., or 50 feet to maybe 150 feet. Those don't make craters, right? So think about the Taurid meteor stream. You can see it every year, and that's the one we suspect all of this came from. In late June, early July, late October, early November, we encounter that stream. And normally it's a meteor shower, right? But occasionally, and this had been long published by a group of very well-respected British astronomers called the British Neo-Catastrophists, and led by Dr. Bill Napier and Victor Klube. And Dr. Napier still lives today and is a friend and a wonderful, wonderful man. And they published a number of papers starting in the 1970s that said, hey, this meteor stream, it may cause havoc during historical times. And we believe that 20,000 years ago, when we reverse engineer what we see now from the Taurid stream, we believe 20,000 years ago, a large comet entered the solar system, 60 kilometers or so, and began fragmenting. And it has progressively fragmented since. But we encounter the chunky parts of that fragmented stream on occasion, and that can be a repeated trauma within a certain window of years until we kind of get out of that period, right? So I don't believe there was necessarily just one day. I believe that we probably had, increased periods of activity at various times through historical and prehistorical, going back 20,000 years, where it caused a trauma.
Let me interrupt you here, because this strikes me as a curiosity. Every time I encounter these ideas, I've not studied it like you or others, but I've encountered them for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
I try and picture this, the path of our Earth and Sun as it continues to, let me just say the Earth. I picture the path of the Earth twice per year, encountering this highway of debris from the torrid meteor stream, right? And I'm wondering why. I don't know if we've got a good answer to this, but why is it that, say, 12,800 years ago, thereabouts, for a period of centuries, perhaps, there is what appears to be, feel free to correct me, regular encounters with this debris for a very long period of time, and then for thousands of years, maybe mostly what we're getting is just a good light show in June and October in the nighttime and early morning skies. We all look forward to going out now in the spring and fall months and looking at the meteor show, right? And but we're not overly concerned about that meteor show turning into impactors in our neck of the woods, or maybe some small fragments will reach the Earth. But what is it about? Is it just because once you got through that period of time that lasted either decades or centuries, the potential for those to be large and impactful just continued to diminish, and so we're getting to a period where it's less and less likely that would cause a problem? Or is it still a tremendous problem and risk today?
Well, it's certainly less likely.
Yeah, because there's just not as much debris.
Yeah, the fragments are going through a process called hierarchical disintegration, and that means originally one thing, and then it starts to fragment, and many comets fragment. Schwarzman-Wachmann is a comet that's fragmenting now, and we encounter it periodically in a short period orbit. But one turns into two, one of the two turns into three, the other one turns into two itself, and they don't, it's not perfect, but you end up with a hell of a lot of small ones, and then many fewer big ones. And the part about it being recurring over a period of hundreds of years, that's more speculation. That the theory is stronger just saying we hit a bad spot of it. But we continue to hit bad spots of it. The Tunguska explosion that I described before in Siberia, it was on June 30th. That in our mind is not a coincidence. So we caught one that day, just one. And it is like traffic. And that's the way Dr. Napier described it to me, that it's like we're walking across twice a year a highway, and most of them with a blindfold on. And if you walk across a highway with a blindfold on at various periods during the day, most of the day, you're probably going to be fairly safe. But you're going to hit, around 4:30, you're going to start hitting some heavy traffic. And we hit periods where we're getting filaments of that toroidal string of debris that are chunkier. And it doesn't have to be tremendously chunky. I'm not talking about, the thing that killed the dinosaurs. But if you have these 50, 100 foot, 150 foot objects coming in, when they hit our atmosphere, that's like you jumping off a bridge into the water. You don't make a crater on the bottom, right? To be kind of dramatic about it. The density changes, and you blow up in the water if you're high enough, right? Think of the atmosphere that same way. That the change in density, and I know you know these things, and you probably know.
That's great to bring it up. Yeah.
Yeah, but the change from the near vacuum of space to the atmosphere,
to our atmosphere,
is as dramatic as hitting concrete.
I say that all the time to people. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And you're going to have all of that kinetic transfer. You're going to have all that heat and all that pressure, and it's not necessarily going to make it all the way down. Or if it does, it's in a plume of, 5, 6,000 degree. And this is all well documented, even by our critics. One of the absolute chief critic of our theory helped document that this is all not just theoretically possible, but it all pencils out that those objects would come in and cause a flash of heat and pressure and blast onto the ground itself that wouldn't form a crater. But what it does do is it kicks up earth material and soil and organic stuff and throws it up into that plume as it blooms back, and shocks back upward. And all of that stuff melted at those temperatures turns into fallout. It's just like a nuclear bomb without the radioactivity. And nuclear bombs, when they explode them, leave spherules because it blows that stuff up in what's a vaporous, if you will, a diffuse liquid form, and that those little droplets then freeze, and they drop down, and they create that layer. And that's what we're seeing when we see the abundance of those tiny spherules.
This might be too much of a tangent, but like
There's
no tangent, no such thing. All right, good.
Well, between us chickens. Yeah.
So what is it that these extraterrestrial objects have the potential of introducing into the ecology of Earth? I mean, what do they bring with them? Is it people just tend to picture metals, rare earth metals as we call them, but what else is coming in from out there and being introduced into the ecosystem of the Earth?
Well, that gets me into panspermia. I believe that comets are seething with life. And my mentor there is a wonderful gentleman named Chandra Wickramasinghe. And he studied for 40 years under his very, very dear mentor, Sir Fred Hoyle, who was the #1 astronomer in England for most of his lifetime. He was obviously recognized as such. And Fred and Chandra say that, you're bringing in that they're a disease vector. And the origin of most viruses and, in fact, genetic manipulations are coming from inputs from above that are both actually constantly at work, but obviously enhanced by direct input from comet fragments. So that's one thing. And that helps explain the dramatic changes in, uniformitarianism in geology is like Darwinism is to biology, right? They're both kind of hurt. They're right, but they're long periods of quiescence interrupted by moments of dramatic change. And both of those processes create the world we see today. So with biology, you go through normal Darwinian evolution, I believe with some input from above, as a regular kind of fallout from space. And remember, this can be cosmic dust, which is parts of comets anyway. And when you say a virus comes in from space, immediately people go, that can't be. It wouldn't survive out there. No. If you're talking about, a tiny, tiny piece of dust versus a virus, that virus is 10,000 times smaller, maybe 100,000. You could put a million of those viruses in one tiny speck of dust. That makes a fine space capsule. Right? So for microbial life, those little bits of dust, if Hoyle and Wickramasinghe are right, that comets are seething balls of life to some degree, to a great degree, when they fragment and when they cast off their dust, those little pieces, some degree of that life, or, viruses aren't necessarily clearly life, but certainly genetic, that it can provide inputs to biology. So that's one process. But then there's another process that we haven't mentioned yet that people who are unfamiliar with this need to know, that 12,800 years ago was a break point in human ecology, in faunal ecology in North America particularly.
Did you say a breakthrough in faunal ecology?
Yeah, 250 species of animals either go extinct or begin a process by which they shortly became totally extinct at that time. And that includes the woolly mammoth, the giant ground sloth, the American lion, the American camel, Bison antiquus, which was a gigantic bison, 250 species, 38 genera of animals either go extinct or begin a fairly abbreviated process towards extinction. And we believe that was caused by the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis 12,800 years ago, that it wiped those creatures out largely, Not saying it vaporized every last animal. They all disappeared. And we're not saying it vaporized every last human, right? But it changed everything. That we went from the Serengeti on steroids with gigantic mammals. I mean, hell, there was a damn armadillo the size of a golf cart, right? So, called a glyptodon. And that's only 3 times the period of the pyramids ago. People got to put this into perspective. The comet dinosaur thing was 66 million years ago. This was 3,500 times more recent. So if you had a timeline from here at the Atlantic Ocean all the way to California, say it's roughly 3,500 miles, right? The Younger Dryas event would be, at the Circle K convenience store, a mile over there, where the dinosaur thing is all the way in California. That this is so much more recent. Not quite as dramatic, but pretty dramatic. So then you say, well, good gosh, what caused what is the mainstream thing? If we're talking controversial science, what does the mainstream say caused the extinction of all of those animals? And since Paul Martin published this theory in 1968, which was an interesting time period, kind of the first politicized science in my view, at least in these realms, he said we hunted them to death. That the Clovis people, who are the first well-acknowledged continent-wide people in North America, and there's great speculation now finally being accepted that there were certainly precursor people to them to some degree in North America, reaching back 30 and 40,000 years now. But everybody agrees that the first time that it really shows up, that it's clearly obvious, is roughly 13,000 years ago, and they might have only persisted for about 300 years. And they populated the continent, from Tierra del Fuego to Miami to Seattle. And that they would have hunted every one of those animals down. Every last
They were hungry. You got to eat those armadillos.
So, yeah, who goes and kills the last armadillo? While there's still a fish, right, and an acorn out there. Why would you go hunt the last cave bear? Hell, 2 species of birds go extinct. Who hunted down the last bird? And all of this with spears. It's beyond conceivable.
Right.
It's an insult to Southern Africa now. Why haven't they extincted? They've been working on those elephants for a long, long time, and didn't make the elephant go extinct. But people with spear points 13,000 years ago, within the period of a few hundred years, managed to hunt down every last animal of 250 species. But it was very convenient politically, because people are rapacious, and we do cause extinctions. And during the late 60s, we were coming to grips with that, and we needed to come to grips with that. But just like so much of, if you will, that kind of progressive politics, some take it way too far and try to, provide explanations for things that are very, very politically convenient, but are also just damned implausible, right?
Well, and I think that's the important key that you've done an excellent job covering some of that. But while something might be possible, that is entirely different than something being entirely plausible. And as you discuss the potential, earlier we were talking about the Carolina Bays, and there are alternative hypotheses for how these might form. And while they may be possible, you have to ask yourself, when you consider the evidence, what is more likely and what is plausible. And that's why I find this
and what's
conversation.
Your gut say? There's
that's important.
And you look at the bays and say, hey, was that caused by a wind that came in, 3 or 4 times over prehistory and blew all of those little depressions into varying things? I'm just uncomfortable with it. And most people that first look at it you've got to be so smart that you get past your intuition. You have to be taught with something else. Because anyone's intuition, most people look and they go, well, clearly they're craters. Why is it even controversial? And you're like, well,
then there's meteor holes. Hey, let me put a plug in here for several different things, and then I want to go to 2 other things as we wrap up here, George. as you were talking about that period where there's megafaunal extinction, I had a few thoughts, a couple book recommendations. I'm just going to throw them in here. Some are directly related, some are tangentially related, but Graham Hancock's most recent book, America Before, was a really interesting read and a good introduction if you've not taken a look at some of those ancient civilizations or cultures that we both understand and suppose have lived here. That's a great place to start looking at ancient American history, in my view. And there's a lot of, despite the past couple of decades of some of the orthodoxy wanting to label someone like Graham Hancock a fringer or a woo-woo guy, he does an excellent job teasing out some of what is actually known, and also making it clear when something is not known but is rather speculation.
He does an excellent job of that and gets very little credit from his critics.
And my understanding is more and more, as a new generation of scientists of various fields come into their own, they're willing to consider his work more than perhaps the previous generation may have. So I want to put in a plug for that work. There's another work that's only tangentially related, but I think of it so often. I've read it twice. It's worth the time. And it's a book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. We've talked about uniformitarianism and we've talked about catastrophism here. And while the book isn't about those things, he talks about great periods of same old that are interrupted by punctuated periods of dramatic change in the sciences. And he traces through the last several centuries of how that process kind of unfolds. But it's a theory of how science or scientific worldview evolves. It's remarkable, and it's not just applicable to the sciences; it's applicable to religious worldviews and so on and so forth. So I wanted to put in a plug for that book as well. I recommend it to people often.
It's a great book. It helps you understand why, because I often get from friends that aren't very sciencey, which is fine. They'll say, well, why isn't it just accepted? All this seems to make sense. Why do people push back so hard against y'all? And I never really got that part. I mean, there's been a lot of pushback about these ideas. When I got in touch with West, we put together 23 of us and published a paper in 2007 that began a knockdown, drag out scientific publishing war that we're still engaged in 15 years later. And it has been ugly, ugly, ugly. They have accused us of out and out fraud, and particularly Allen. And he would have had to been the most nefarious con man of all time to have somehow salted these samples with platinum, peaks and sent them to labs around the world. And a lot of it's independently sent to these labs. I mean, it's just completely implausible that there was any fraud involved. But our critics will even suggest that. It's just awful.
Yeah, because their entire life's work is potentially upended by the new view.
That's right. And the people who push back hardest are those who have the most to lose, right? And that's always telling. And a lot of those are the archaeologists, and there's still some out there that believe that humans hunted all those animals down. The more common explanation now is it was climate change. Well, you're damn right. I agree with that. It was climate change. The climate changed very, very dramatically and suddenly. And, you ask them what changed the climate, what changed the Younger Dryas. They say, well, there's a big influx of water into the Gulf Stream 13,000 years ago, of fresh water, and that shut down the thermohaline circuit. Yeah, you go, well, where'd that come from? They say, well, it came from a big lake on the ice sheet. Say, well, why'd that let go? They say, well, we don't really know. So we're fine with them up until that point. We say what happened was that there was multiple impacts and blasts into the ice sheet in the northern hemisphere at the time, and that shattered the ice sheet. And sea levels rose very dramatically at that time, and the Earth froze back up. And then there was another meltwater pulse, 1,200 years later. And that's one of the damnedest things to me is how violent the climate swings were all before 11,600 years ago. And then it cools off, and we've lived in this very, very even climate sense. Now, minor fluctuations relative to the stuff. But we came out of the Younger Dryas in an instant, and things have been pretty cool since then. But we believe it can change. So yeah, that the scientific debate, we and a great friend and collaborator, Mark Young in Australia, who gave he's an archaeology student at Flinders University, and I'll give you this link for your show notes.
Yeah, we'll put it on the screen here.
Yeah, he gave a terrific talk in Adelaide, Australia, 2 weeks ago. And you can find that on the Cosmic Tusk. I think it's the top post now, actually, at cosmictusk.com. And Mark's the second generation, of scientists that are coming up that does accept this, that want to investigate it with an open mind, that believe the evidence is there to move this from a hypothesis to a theory. But he helped me, going back 5 or 6 years ago, put together a full-fledged bibliography that you can find at the Cosmic Tusk by clicking the top right drop-down little hamburger thing. We're going to change that. We're upgrading the Tusk here soon. You hit that, and you find the comprehensive Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis bibliography, where we have it.
It's phenomenal.
Yeah, we started in 2007 with that first paper, and then we have them color-coded with some editorial judgment on what their positions are. And it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And people like Martin Sweatman in the UK, wonderful PhD engineer, physicist over there who's taken this subject on. He went and is on YouTube, and he reads every damn paper, every last one, and reviews it, and reveals the critical papers to not only be on soft ground, but actually they generally have some nuggets in them that support us, those that go and investigate the evidence themselves. But then they tone that down, they take the parts, and cherry pick our stuff. And it's just been a Kuhnian, as you said, just right out of Thomas Kuhn's book, change in paradigm. But we're going to stick to it. We're not going to give up, and we're going to win. And you'd like it to take 1 or 2 years, maybe a decade. We're working on 50 years now. But, it's been discussed since Plato. Plato said, and I believe it's around 280 BC, said 9,000 years before my own time, there was a tremendous cataclysm. And that's another thing. People say, well, why wouldn't we know about this? Well, my God, every single culture on Earth speaks of these cataclysms. And they're going to speak of them in different terms. It might be lightning, bolts out of the sky, snakes in the sky, that kind of stuff. Think about what a snake in the sky is, which is a dragon, right? It has a fiery mouth.
Yeah, I've seen that before on Great Game of Thrones. I know what they are.
Yeah, there you go. I keep wanting Game of Thrones to kind of veer into, and it kind of hints to it. Yeah, so did I tell you the movie, not Greenland, but Don't Look Up. It did a pretty good job on what we're talking about. Yeah, the one with it did it. So it's kind of seeping its way into common culture, and there's don't want to say too much, but there's a Netflix series coming out relatively soon that will be wrap itself around both the Younger Dryas Impact and also the belief by Graham Hancock and thousands of others worldwide that there were precursor civilizations or a civilization.
Let me say something about that, because you mentioned the black mat layer. You've mentioned early, the Clovis people in the Americas, in North America. Do they stretch down into South America?
They do, all the way to Tierra del Fuego.
And there's this mass extinction of hundreds of species. And now my understanding is that the Younger Dryas period had perhaps a more devastating impact on the Northern Hemisphere than it did on the Southern Hemisphere, but I don't know that. Is that true, or is that not true?
Yeah, it's unclear. We had a paper from Palauco, Chile, that demonstrated that the YD is evident down there.
So it's a global phenomenon.
In Venezuela. Yeah, we believe it was global. We've never been to a place that we haven't found it. But we're of limited means too. There are no big National Science Foundation grants driving our stuff, even though an angel has popped up and more to come on that. There's going to be a significant injection of cash into our efforts, and also some interest on doing expeditions elsewhere to find the black mat. But it appears South America got warmer, that it did the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
But there were extinctions there as well. And, we believe it was global.
Well, I view, clearly those are destructive periods. There was one 66 million years ago, thereabouts. There's one 12,800 years ago, thereabouts. There's one 1,700 years ago. And there appear to be periodic cataclysmic disruptions of both the ecosystem, human civilization. And I want to just at least tee up the idea for the listener. The idea is that there may be periods or cycles of destruction and recreation of the earth on which we live. In fact, if you look at the black mat layer, what came before and what came after were two entirely different worlds. The ecosystem is different. The life is different. Human civilization is rebooted, if you will.
Yeah.
And so I work with that idea in my own worldview, and whether it sits well with people or not, they can play with that a little bit and see if they can't tease out both the religious and scientific worldview somewhat.
Well, I'm so glad that you have gotten interested in this subject, Matt, because you're a great communicator. You've got a lot of tremendous integrity, which has been demonstrated to the nation. And having proponents like yourself out there, we keep adding to the team.
Yeah.
Right. And those
all important. This is important.
Open-minded, brave people. That intellectual cowardice need not apply on this. And we're not going to know all the details.
That's right.
But it's okay to speculate. And it's even better to provide evidence for speculation. But there are elements in society now that don't like speculating about how we might have been terribly wrong, with some of the given paradigms.
Isn't it just a paradox that that's the case when we live in a postmodern world that insists on things like men can get pregnant?
Yeah.
We live in a really odd time in which we insist on absurdities, but we're unwilling to speculate about that which we have an abundance of evidence. It's a really odd thing. So I want to wrap up our interview, George, by two different things. One, I want, if you're willing, to talk about an upcoming event that you're planning, which will happen next year, and then also point people to where they can find your work. We've already mentioned Cosmic Tusk, but once
I'm pretty
again,
active
point
on
us to other
Twitter
places.
too.
Okay.
Yeah, at Cosmic Tusk, George A. Howard at Cosmic Tusk, and Twitter's a weak read for communication, but I like it. And it's kind of funny, you search Younger Dryas, and that's Younger as it's spelled, Dryas. That's a great search term because it doesn't come up anywhere else. And what you'll see is the mainstream understanding of it littered with our work and then other people's speculation. So you have the mainstream, you'll have our work, and then you'll have Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson's work are all visible by that one search term and not polluted with any other thing because it's such a strange term. So it's easy to follow up on. With regard to the conference, I don't mind talking about it. I don't want to pimp it too much because we don't have the website up. I'm working on it now. I've got the new logos in front of me. I've got the copy in front of the web team. But April 13th, 14th, and 15th of next year in Asheville, North Carolina, we're going to have the Cosmic Catastrophist Conference, COSCAT 2023. And we're going to try to get all of us nuts in a room together, kind of like we did in Sedona, and have some really fun people speak. And Graham Hancock will speak, Randall Carlson, Johanna James, and Jimmy Corsetti, who people may have seen on Rogan, who runs the Bright Insight YouTube channel. And they're kind of our big four. And Matt, I don't mind saying that you have very, very graciously agreed to
keep it secret
to us as well.
No, teasing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, we got about a dozen people that are going to be great contributors to it. And then the most fun part is, and we saw this in Sedona, is getting around the other people who have an interest in these matters. And we're all kind of siloed on the internet. And boy, it is fun to get in other people's company and have a few beers and talk about this stuff. And we're going to do the hell out of it next spring in Asheville, North Carolina.
Well, I think it's going to be a big success. You're way ahead of the power curve, and we'll get we're getting the word out early and often, and we'll get all the right people there and then some.
Well, but I'll tell you, this is the first time I have mentioned it or announced it. Nothing on Twitter.
Well, I'm honored.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I don't know whether you should be honored, but I'm honored to be able to bring it around. I can see that it's going to happen now. What I don't want to do, there's some people wanting to do teaser videos and all that, but you don't want to tease people unless they have a website to go to.
That's right. Yep.
Right. So check back, folks. Cosmic Tusk or elsewhere. It'll actually be coscat2023.com. Also, the Cosmic Catastrophist Conference. Thought about Cosmic Catastrophes Conference, but I wanted to focus on the people. That what we are catastrophists, and we need a place to gather. And so there'll be a website, there'll be a sign up, and there'll be a live stream of the whole event for people that can't make it in person. I'm going to have I think, a very attractively priced live stream. And it'll go all the way from live stream to VIP, where you can have dinner and a lecture from Graham.
Good.
And all that's being put together. And thank you for bringing it up. I'm happy to mention it first on your podcast.
Well, it's going to be great. So you mentioned cosmictusk.com.
Yeah.
Where else can people go? You mentioned your YouTube channel.
Yeah, the cometresearchgroup.org. And that website's getting a little long in the tooth, but it's still good, and it has a lot of information, and it gives you bios and of the entire team of people. We're up to over 70 or so, right? Are all listed on there. Might even be more than that of PhDs around the world in literally a dozen, 24 different disciplines who are part of the Comet Research Group. And I highly recommend one particular paper. And that's by a wonderful new addition, just like yourself, to the advocates and proponents. And frankly, he's a defender of us. He was a former skeptic, Dr. James Lawrence Powell, and he's a 2-time college president. And he's written both a book called Ancient Voyager on our subject. But if you don't want to buy the book, a paper he wrote in January of this year is called Premature Rejection in Science, the Case for the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis. And he is an eminent scholar and geologist, and he was initially very skeptical of our claims, and but he was good friends with one of the senior researchers on our team, Dr. James Kennett, who's a member of the National Academy of Sciences with him. And he takes Jim Kennett seriously. And he heard Kennett talk about it. And he's an old friend of his. And he said, well, I got to look into this just out of respect for Jim. I've got to go look into this, which I'm naturally skeptical of because I cannot believe we would have missed something like this. And he looked into it and he said, holy shit, these guys are right. And not only he took the next step, and he wrote an entire book laying out the trauma that we've been through during the paradigm change and all of the evidence. And then he summarized that in the paper, Premature Rejection in Science, the Case for the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis by James Lawrence Powell. And that is a great read for those that are interested in both the hard evidence and even more so kind of the sociology of the paradigm change. Why is it spat back? Why hadn't it gotten the traction it should, being perhaps the most important discovery of all time from an Earth history sense?
That's great. One of the things that's exciting to me about doing interviews like yours, George, is that I come most recently from a community within our Defense Department that is our newest branch of the military, the U.S. Space Force. And as our young Space Force guardians try and wrap their minds around the domain for which they've got a stewardship from a national defense perspective, I'm really hoping that they'll find, they should, if they're willing to put in the effort of listening to the episode, they'll find some benefit in what you've shared today as well. So your words will not only get out in that conference next April, we'll put the links to these articles that you've mentioned today, 2 of them, the one you just mentioned and the other one I promised that we'd put in the description. And I'm really hoping also your voice is going to reach into the defense community as well, especially our Space Force personnel. So
that is really exciting, Matt. Thank you. What an opportunity.
Yeah, grateful to have you on the show. Any last words?
Not at all. I look forward to seeing you in April, and I look forward to you being a new good friend in this subject matter. And we'll do this again sometime, and I'll keep you up on developments. There's always something coming up new on this. It ticks like a clock. About once a month, there's something, good and juicy about the Younger Dryas Impact. And that's going to accelerate too. So thank you for the opportunity to lay it out thus far, the story thus far.
Good. Well, a lot of exciting developments here. George Howard, thanks for joining us on the Matt Lohmeyer Show.
Thank you, Colonel Lohmeyer.